It's more of a suggestion.
Yes, it will be a suggestion. And I'm like,
So last night,
hey Julia, hi Terry, good to see you again. Oh yeah, I really enjoy playing the guitar, so it's good. Sure, yeah, it does not happen every Sunday. Yeah. Good to see you, Julia.
I saw that lady talking. Somebody came behind us. I said, oh, there's another one.
We will get started in a couple of minutes, y'all.
Oh, well.
Her name is Kelly. Her name is Kelly. Who has a son named Finn as well. Yeah. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started.
Great.
That's
Oh,
for you.
thank you. Thank you. Put this over here with my stuff so I don't.
All right. Hello, Diana.
Maybe we should pull out a little bit.
We should pull.
Perfect.
We can do that.
I
There
feel
we
like
go.
we're sort of stuck in the
We
back
can
there.
get a little closer. Good, almost afternoon, everyone. We are going to be having a dialogue with Diana today. I'm going to open it up with a question or two to get the conversation started, and there will be opportunities for you to share questions as well. I do want to, I'll use the word implore you to keep your questions brief. And so if we can have as many questions as possible during the time that we have. So I will implore you again, keep your questions brief, and I'll try to keep my questions brief. And Diana, you talk as long as you want.
I was going to say you should implore the guest preacher to go shorter.
That's all right. We appreciate your words and appreciate you being here. So thank you. And thanks
you.
for sharing this time with us now.
Yeah.
So many of us here in the church, including myself, have read your book, Freeing Jesus. But for those of us who haven't read the book, I just kind of want to get us started with that conversation. So I thought we begin with a question that Krista Tippett often shares on her podcast, On Being, that can you share with us a bit of the spiritual landscape of your childhood and perhaps how it contrasts or is consistent with who you are today?
Oh, my. Freeing Jesus, of course, is what I call memoir theology. So I don't really call it a spiritual memoir, but I reversed the order of those two words because I wanted the book itself, to be a theology. So the emphasis falls on who Jesus is and to take seriously our lives as a text to answering that question of who Jesus is. So memoir theology is looking at our own experiences and drawing from that how we have encountered God, and in the case of Freeing Jesus, Jesus in particular. So the book opens with a story that I tell about being in the National Cathedral when I am an adult. But then what I call the second opening of the book comes at the very beginning of the first chapter, and it tells the story of, I was probably about 3 years old or so, sitting in a circle in a Methodist Sunday school classroom. And in that classroom, my teacher, who I still remember, Miss Jean, for any of you who are ever Sunday school teachers or who think you might want to do it, that a 64-year-old woman can still remember her the Sunday school teacher when she was 3 years old is really something. Miss Jean was sitting in a circle with us in those little teeny tiny, chairs that are in Sunday school classrooms, and she told us the story of Jesus loves the little children. And as she told us the story, she held up a picture. Anyone who was here yesterday, I had a picture on a slide of the very image that she shared with us. And in that image, there was a little girl who was about my age, and she had her head leaning on Jesus' shoulder. And as Miss Jean told the story about Jesus welcoming the children, and I saw that picture and the little girl, I thought, Jesus is my friend. And that icon and that image and that realization of the friendship that we can have with God has stayed with me my entire life. And I wrote most of the book during the pandemic, the early stages of it, and it came out in 21. The pandemic is still going on. And the friend chapter was written when I couldn't see any of my actual friends. And so the whole image of Jesus as friend refreshed itself in isolation during the time of the pandemic. So a 3-year-old realization that can stretch through a lifetime and then have this incredibly different and new meaning in the circumstances that we've all been through in recent years. I think that's fairly astonishing. And I consider that the work of the Spirit.
Thank you for sharing. I'm going to open it up. There is a microphone somewhere in the room. I think someone was taking care of that. So if you have a question that you have for Diana, this will be the moment to do so. Rob, looks like Dave has it in the back.
Yeah.
So you can raise your hand. Rob will either bring you the mic or throw it at you, one of the two. I hope you can catch.
And don't be shy. Good.
Are we on? Yeah, Lisa here. Hi, thank you for coming. This morning, while you were talking about fellowship, it got me wondering, do you know why, or when, or where, or how? Where did we as Christians switch from Sunday being the sacred day versus Jewish tradition of Saturday? Because you're talking about fellowship, and fellowship to me says dinner, and I was like, cow, why did we get on to Sunday being the day?
That is probably one of the shortest answers I can offer. It's because it's the morning of the resurrection. And so Jesus was in the tomb over the Jewish Sabbath, and it was the morning after the Jewish Sabbath, Saturday, that the women went to the tomb to anoint Jesus' body, and he was gone. And so that's when Christians decided to make the day after the Jewish Sabbath their day of gathering and prayer. Yep, easy answer, yay. Sometimes church history is a good thing.
Hi, I have a question. With the growing number of people who identify as spiritual but not religious,
Yes.
and it seems like they're not attracted to the Christian church, where do you see spiritual development happening for the vast majority of people?
Yeah, you know, that term, spiritual but not religious, I think was a bit more prominent in the early aughts, you know, the zeros, than it might be now as we've entered into the 2020s. What is, I think, more prevalent now is people just saying, I'm not religious. You know, so they are disaffiliating. There's a large movement among younger evangelical Christians of deconstruction. And so I think that right now there's just an enormous amount of spirituality that is involved in taking things apart. And I guess we might not always think of that as a spiritual movement, because my sense, of course, I suspect that for many of you, is that spirituality is usually about growing something. It's about nurturing. It's about widening the community. It has these ideas of, you know, the outstretched arms, a lot of the words that were in our service this morning. But the Christian tradition holds within it this other reality as well, that's sometimes been described as like the dark night of the soul or the descent of the soul, where it isn't about what we're growing, but it's instead about moving toward what has been lost. And so while there is a huge decline in religious affiliation, there's all of this language of people turning their backs on faith, and especially institutional forms of faith. I am of the mind that in of itself is spiritual. It doesn't mean that every person who is doing that is going to eventually make a pivot and then come back to, say, some sort of more institutional form of religion. I don't think that's the case. But I do think that most of the people who are finding their deepest sense of meaning and identity and purpose in the moving away from faith, that some portion of them will pivot eventually towards something else. And we don't know what that thing is yet. And so one of the tasks of discernment for folks who are interested in spiritual things, and certainly people who lead religious institutions and who care about them, is to keep our eyes open to where that movement of the Spirit is. One of my conversations with you all this last couple days, I talked about the power of iconoclasm in the Christian church. Christian history has been full of moments where Christians tear everything down. And it's not something we've ever paid a whole lot of attention to, because, who likes to talk about the time when Calvinists went sort of rampaging into Catholic churches and tore out all the statues and broke all the windows? Or when Oliver Cromwell's armies tried to burn down every parish church in England for the Church of England. And early on in the 7th and 8th century, there was a whole movement among Christians to get rid of any kind of representational art of the saints or Jesus or God in order to achieve a purer connection with God. And so the iconoclastic movement itself, which was mostly in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, literally destroyed huge and amazing works of art. Some of you who might have traveled in places like Italy or in Turkey have seen where this happened. And art historians tear their hair out and try to reclaim and fix and reveal those things that have been covered up and scoured away by previous generations of Christians. So right now, I think I'm just sort of leaning in that and saying, this is nothing new in Christianity. It takes different forms at different times, depending upon what sort of the majority religious traditions look like that surround these movements. But there are periods of this taking apart. And we just happen to draw this historical card. So what I would love for folks to be able to do is to rest easier with this, because usually what happens with many Christians is that as soon as you see maybe your own children or grandchildren going through a process of deconstructing their faith, the first response is, oh my gosh, I've got to go in there and I've got to grab them, I've got to pull them back in, and what am I going to do? And who's going to be in the church after us? Who can take care of all these buildings if they all go away? And what's going to happen to, XYZ, because nobody's there to fill my shoes or the shoes of those who care about these things. So that's the first tendency, is we want to fix what we perceive to be a problem of iconoclasm. But if we recognize that it's an impulse that ultimately has wound up in Christian history to be an impulse of renewal, then that might take us to a slightly different place, where we can be able to look at the taking apart time to teach us where we might be going after the pivot. But we're not at the pivot. We're not anywhere, I don't think we're anywhere near the pivot yet. I wish we were, but we aren't. So I guess I'm saying, don't be afraid when you see these things happen. Recognize, those of you who are UCC or Presbyterian background, your ancestors did this a lot, actually. My ancestors in the Episcopal Church didn't like you much for it. And certainly any Catholics who are here in the audience, they were really angry at you. But this is just the way the history unfolds. And maybe we can take some comfort in the fact that we're actually imitating the patterns of some of our most passionate ancestors, even when our children or grandchildren seem to be rejecting that faith. They're actually reenacting part of the faith that they might not be aware of, which is kind of interesting and sort of funny in a way. So.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Explain to us how the concept of the Trinity got started, and how does that affect our sense of community today?
That's actually, I'm laughing, but that's actually a good question. I haven't answered that question since I taught Doctrine 101. The Trinity started in a sort of a very interesting and sort of logical way. It's not specifically, of course, in the New Testament, which would be the first thing any Jehovah's Witness who comes knocking on your door will tell you. The best thing to do is to not say, you're wrong about that, and I'll show you the Bible verse, because they're pretty much right that it isn't in the New Testament. But what was in the New Testament is all this evidence that those first people those ones who responded to the message, he is risen, he's not here anymore, then they got baptized. Their impulse was, as it says in the text, they were filled with awe, and they couldn't believe all the signs and wonders that were being done. And so that meant that in some way Jesus was special or unique, or that experience they had of the resurrection had elevated Jesus to some status that they had never anticipated him being on. And so then we get all those stories about him appearing and dropping in and all that sort of stuff. My husband always refers to it as spooky Jesus. And so when something that is deeply supernatural, that escapes the words that we have or the concepts that we have to explain it, people begin to reach for other kinds of languages. And so those first Christians, they were certainly questioning how Jesus was related to God the Father. And these are mostly Jews who are the first Christians. And so they had no desire at all to be sort of not anything other than monotheists. So they didn't want to be duotheists, worshiping Jesus and the Father. And then this experience of the Holy Spirit emerges, and that is just as powerful as the experience of the resurrection. And so then, are we tritheist? And so essentially, their spiritual experience elevated these other manifestations of the presence of God, and then they had to figure that out. Philosophically and theologically. And it took them centuries, literally, to do that. But it did emerge from their experience of who Jesus was and who the Holy Spirit was in their midst. So in that sense, when I think about Trinitarian development, I think about it in a very empathetic way. They weren't trying to devise a bunch of doctrines that would torture us 2,000 years later. And that didn't seem to make much sense. Thomas Jefferson once referred to it as that incomprehensible arithmetic of the Trinity. And so there's that part of it. But if I think about them trying to develop languages to communicate a mystery of their own spiritual experience, well, then I find myself sort of leaning into it in a softer way, that it's less about the incomprehensible arithmetic and more about people who were remarkably like us, who encountered God in ways that they never anticipated, that turned their lives inside out, upside down, and backwards. And they were trying to figure out how do we talk about this in the context of the world in which we live. So that would be the first 7 minutes, I guess, of my lecture on Trinitarian development in the early church with my students years and years and years ago. I think I was a little bit more skeptical when I presented that to students all those years ago. I taught at an evangelical college. You always, I confess, I wanted to poke a little bit, at their faith to make them a little uncomfortable and to get them to thinking bigger questions. And so my own skepticism would come through in some of those issues. But now, there's so much more, I think, of my own experience that is just willing to say, with some level of compassionate wonder, what would I have done if I was in their shoes? And how would these same things have impacted me? And what choices would I have made intellectually, poetically, emotionally, all of those kinds of things in order to try to communicate the power of what I'd just been through. And so while I once had a little bit more fun leaning towards the skeptical part of that arithmetic, now I'm much more comfortable with the mystery of it without being dogmatic about the mystery. And I like the place where I am with this. Thomas Jefferson was right. It is incomprehensible.
Hi, I'm Deb. The late Phyllis Tickle.
Yes.
I just assume you probably knew her. She had she quoted someone else that had a concept of basically every 500 years, the church has a big rummage sale. So that's necessary in order to clear out the nonsense that accumulates, like scaffolding on a building. Sometimes you can't, it's hard to differentiate between the scaffolding and the actual building. So we had the first 500 years with the councils and so forth, the Great Schism around,
Right.
yeah, and then the Reformation, which we just celebrated the 500th anniversary of recently. So it seems like we're kind of due. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts related to that whole concept, which I find quite fascinating.
The ghost of Phyllis is haunting me. The first time Phyllis ever said that out loud was at a conference that we were co-leading. And I remember sitting there going, oh my gosh, what am I going to do with this? And she was quoting an Episcopal bishop by the name of Mark Dyer, who had been my pastor when I was 25, 26, and 27 years old. And so I had first heard that concept from the horse's mouth, as it were, the late Mark Dyer, great bishop in the Episcopal Church. So Phyllis borrowed that, and then she began to use it in relationship to what she called the Great Emergence, this time of being due for something new to emerge. And this really goes with the other question that was asked. Because in order for something new to come, old stuff has to go away. There has to be room made for the new thing. And so oftentimes these shifts that Phyllis talked about, which she believed happened every 500 years, were accompanied by periods of the taking apart. She didn't call them iconoclasm, which really surprises me as I think back. She probably should have, and maybe I'm just here to do that for her. So that was her theory, that there was these kinds of fairly predictable cycles in church history, and that we were at the beginning of the new 500-year cycle. And I think that there's a lot to that kind of pattern, and I do believe she was right. And what Phyllis and I would sometimes say to each other in public, it would always get a laugh, we got practiced at it because people ask us so much, was someone would ask her to explain her comment about the rummage sales, every 500-year rummage sales. And then someone would ask me, well, Diana, what do you think about that? And I would say, well, and I give you the same answer, well, I have a PhD in history from Duke University, and if I start talking about predictable historical cycles, the dean is going to get on an airplane, come out here from North Carolina, and take my degree away. And so historians are far more humble about predictable patterns than wonderful, amazing writers like Phyllis Tickle, who I think taught us beautiful things about change and hoping for change. So I am not entirely convinced that this happens on any kind of regular basis or it's predictable once every 500 years, but I do think things like this have happened before. And the thing that I think really differentiates my view of this from Phyllis, and we talked about this all the time in public, so I'm not speaking ill of the dead, is that I wondered if the kind of pattern of the taking away and the emerging of the new might be speeding up with globalization and technology and sort of a faster advance of human experience. And I'm still wondering about that. So instead of it being a 500-year cycle, maybe the most ancient cycles were 500 years, but maybe then they became like 250 years, and maybe then they became like a century, and maybe now they're 50 years, or maybe now they're 25. We don't know. But we do know is that for the new thing to emerge, the old thing must give it room. And that was the essential wisdom, I think, of the rummage sale. You're welcome.
Diana, I am James W. Left, not right.
God bless you, James W. Left.
Help me out. I thought there was an Apostles' Creed about about 150 in the year.
You know, there are nascently different forms of it, which basically what the Apostles' Creed sort of did in the first, I mean, it's still when you talk about 150 or 160 or 170 being the first recognizable form of something that we would call the Apostles' Creed, we're still now talking 125 to 140, 150 years after the death of Jesus. So this is a long lag period. And what I think that the Apostles' Creed in its first forms is a shortened version of what we see in the book of Acts. Basically, it's a kind of a pointer of salvation history and a quick compression of the last week of the events of Jesus' life. And so the creed becomes a shorthand way of explaining that longer story that gets unfurled, as it were, by Peter in Acts chapter 2 and then again partly in Acts chapter 4. So there are things that are floating around that are fairly early, nascent creeds. They don't get formalized and regularized until 300 and 400, as you well know. But this question of these earlier creeds is the one that I've just sort of gotten completely fascinated by in recent years. And this Patterson book, it's called The Forgotten Creed, and he makes the point that those words of Paul, which show up in Galatians 3:28, in Christ there is no longer Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for we are all one in Jesus Christ. He makes the point that those were probably the words that were said over people as they came up out of the baptism waters. And he draws on a few other scholars who have pointed similarly. And then he brings to bear some other literature from the early Christian church that is extra biblical. And so I just think it is really compelling. He thinks it was used in the form that it shows up in Galatians. He thinks that form was in play within a year, 5 years, 10 years of Jesus' death, which would be absolutely I think that's just a fascinating thing. I believe that Patterson is UCC. Do you know him at all? Have you ever met him?
Yeah, he's UCC.
Yeah, he is UCC. He taught at Eden for a long time, and I'm constantly running into UCC pastors who had him for New Testament. And whenever I quote him, they said, "Oh, he taught that in class. You mean he wrote a book about it?" And so I highly recommend the book. It's called The Forgotten Creed. It's easy to read. It is scholarly, but it's not one of those kind of scholarly books that makes your eyes fall out. It's about 140 pages long, so it's not the longest book on the planet. And it was published by Oxford University Press, and it won the Grawemeyer Award in 2019, which is the most substantial prize given to a book published in religion. The subtitle of the book is something to the effect of The Forgotten Creed, How Earliest Christianity Defeated Bigotry, Economic Inequality, and Sexism, or something like that. That is a very UCC title, by the way. So, and it's great scholarship. So every church I've ever recommended it to has come back to me and said, "Oh my gosh, this book changed our church." So that's a pretty amazing recommendation. Mm-hmm.
Good
yes,
morning.
down here. Oh, back there. Yes.
I heard the word kindness that was not spoken this morning during your sermon. Can you tell me why kindness is not a prominent word among world religions today?
Why kindness is not a prominent word among world religions today? Gosh, I have no idea how to answer that question. I actually hear it a lot, so I'm surprised that you would think that it wasn't prominent. I hear it quite a bit from my Sufi friends and from Sikh friends, Buddhist friends. I think it's more common maybe in those traditions. Kindness in Christianity, I think, falls under charity and generosity and some other words like that, whereas kindness might not be lifted out as a specific kind of disposition. It certainly is rolled into any number of the fruit of the Spirit, and it is also, I think, rolled into the life of virtue. So kindness, it does indeed matter, and it is part of the tradition, but it's not what I would call kind of one of the leading cards in the Christian vocabulary deck, as it were. And that's okay. You know, every different religion brings different emphases into the issue of human experience. And that we can learn that from other traditions, I think, is to our benefit. I had a friend, there's a really wonderful book. This one just won a big prize, too, a Nautilus Award. Simranjeet Singh wrote a book called All the Light We Give. And it's a really beautiful handbook of Sikhism. And Sikhism talks an enormous amount about unity, light, and kindness. And I had him on my little podcast show that I do through my newsletter community. And people loved him. And I love his book. And it just did win a gold medal from the Nautilus Awards just 2 days ago. I need to write him a note. And so anyway, I that's another book I highly recommend. And to think about that in relationship to Christianity and what that message that our Sikh friends can bring to us in reinterpreting our own virtues and values in the culture that we share with them today. Mm-hmm.
So we are beyond time. I just want to note that it is, I want to honor your time.
Oh.
It is 10 afternoon.
Oh
I think
my
we have
gosh.
time for with one question. Maybe you can end with some closing words.
This woman
you have.
down here has had her hand up for quite
I
some
believe
time.
so. So one or two questions. Just want to honor your
Oh,
time.
we got two women. Okay, let's just do it. Oh. Oh, okay. So this is the rapid fire round.
Our church has recently started a creation justice committee in recognition of our climate emergency. And about 5 or 6 years ago, Elizabeth DeGraff, who is also an Episcopalian minister, came to our grain school at UCCS, and you probably know that she started this movement based on the wheat that was raised in Jesus' time, the Mediterranean, free of genetic techniques and whatnot, really. That's grown into a large movement in California of the planting these ancient wheats that are a lot healthier for us than at the same time. And when she came to the...
Okay, do you have a question? We
Yes,
really
yes,
need
yes.
the question.
She mentioned that she had carpooled to theology school with the woman who started Interfaith Power and Light. So my question is, how did the Episcopalians get so far ahead of us in terms of addressing these environmental issues?
Oh, I don't think anybody's farther ahead than anybody else. Actually, the one person I think is the most prophetic on all of this in terms of mainline Christianity is Bill McKibben, who's a Methodist. And so if there's any prophet that was racing ahead of the rest of us, it was Bill. And I think the rest of us are busy chasing his tailings so that we can make up for lost time. So I highly recommend anything Bill McKibben writes. And thank you, Methodists, for making him a great person that he is.
Thank you for being here. My name is Sally, and I have a question about your book on Grateful.
Oh, good.
How would you relate that to death, and would you expand on that?
Oh, my goodness gracious. Oh, I don't know if this is actually in the book, but I've talked about it since. So there is a deep intertwining between grief and gratitude. And one of the primary feelings that we have when we're grieving is we feel lost, but what are we feeling lost for? Usually it's because we are so grateful for the gifts that that person gave us. And so sometimes grief and gratitude are woven with fine thread. And I've just learned to hold that a bit closer, especially through the pandemic. And there are, I think, other writers who have written well about that. So, thank you. It's a good question.
We have one final
Last
question.
question. Mm-hmm.
John Philip Newell, uses the imagery of birth and midwifery to describe this time of change that we're in. And as a ministerial dinosaur who's starting to wander off the scene, over these next 3 or 4 years of public ministry for me, I have begun to view my own work as midwifery. Like, I don't know what's emerging. I can't see it, and I'm trying, especially as an interim minister, I'm trying to create a space for that emergence. So my quick question is, what advice would you give to me as a midwife?
Oh my.
No pressure.
I wrote the prayer that started my sermon on the fly because of Leanne's mother. And midwifery is about bringing new life into the world. And so as a mom, I can say that when my daughter was born, I had no idea what she would be like when she got to be 25, which is how old she is now. And I'm sure that my mother, if she was alive, would say, oh my gosh, when Diana was born, I had no idea what she would be like when she was 64. And I think that the best thing that midwives and parents, whether biological parents or adopted parents or parents in spirit do, is that we create environments by which the new life can grow to its fullest beauty. And so to me, that is part of the call of, if you want to use this old-fashioned language, that is a part of the call of Mother Church. We're not supposed to be our mothers. We're not supposed to turn into the midwives. But instead, they give us the space to become who we were always intended to be. And so I have always felt that as my call of being a mom, the temptational moments where when I tried to make my daughter over in my own image. And anyone here, all that laughter indicates that anyone who, yeah, you've parented, you know, you're a dad, but you know, that is always the worst moment of parenthood. Maybe not even necessarily for the kid, but for the parent. And so that becomes the learning moment where you say, okay, I got to draw back. And what I'm doing here is I'm not trying to control the way this human being turns out, but instead I'm still in the process of birthing this person. And so I think of spiritual work that way. I think of the work of the church that way. I think of all of our work in mentoring and friendship. And John Philip Newell, of course, being influenced by the idea of the Celtic soul friend. That's basically, of course, what a soul friend does, is a midwife who nurtures the environment so that the life of God can bloom. And that's about the best I think we can do. People always ask historians to predict the future. I always say I missed that class at Duke. I'm not a soothsayer. But I think what we all are, or what we all can be, are tender-hearted, imaginative people who understand that our time in this world is fleeting. It's so short. My good friend Marcus Borg always used to say that. He ended every event. Life is short. And knowing that shortness, we can lean into the wisdom, I think, of our Native American friends who say, okay, yes, it's short, but you're influencing 7 generations into the future. So how do we create that circumstance? Phyllis's question, your question, several questions here. I think we know how to do this if we just attend to it. Yeah. Thank you. Oh, that's so kind. Oh, thank you. Speaking of kindness.
Thank you so much, Diana, for spending your time with us. Yes, you have been a gift to us. So we Thank you so much.
It's been lovely, and I wish you well. I actually put out in my newsletter this morning, if you are in Colorado Springs, you're moving to Colorado Springs, I got a church for you.
Thank you.